At the beginning of this year, I set out to reimagine the way I travel. I had done years full time in a more modern car, but every time I talked to someone doing the same thing in a simpler and older platform, I was inspired to do something like that myself. But with little to none experience with restorations, I did a deep dive into the world of the legendary Land Rover series, which hands down must be the easiest platform to learn by doing because it was built to be simple. And it was also built to be rebuilt by anyone by the looks of it. But this car is 50 years old though, and it has been living by the coast of England, Ireland, and it was also parked 10 years outside at the west coast of Norway. And I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out what that kind of weather will do to the body of these over time. Another downside to a lot of these barn finds, or yard finds as they often are, is in quite recent time these didn't really cost anything, and with the lack of value came lack of care. But this specific one is now being saved at the very edge of being considered garbage. And it's done with the fascination of learning absolutely everything about the car I'm going to travel with, plus a healthy dose of OCD. After a complete strip down of the car, I realized this was not going to be a quick fix over the winter before I could head out again as soon as springtime came around. But at this point I was doing everything so thorough that it didn't really make sense to start doing shortcuts now. So I kept up with the same attention to details without thinking too much whether or not I would be ready as soon as the snow disappeared. But I also had to hold myself back to some degree because after all, this is a car I'm going to travel with full time, and being unnecessarily picky about things that will be bumped and scratched in the future is a bit silly. After all, this is a purpose-made Land Rover that I'm obviously not going to keep in the garage. But the amount of these you'll find painted with a roller over old paint and damages is kinda mind-blowing. But then again, it does make sense considering all of the reasons I just talked about, because they used to be work vehicles with not too high of a value. With the bodywork on this, I've probably gone through the longest continuous process in my life, because everything has been sanded, sandblasted, stripped and worked all the way down to bare metal, followed by all of the aluminium parts getting acid washed, primed with epoxy and finished off with paint. And all of this is something I kinda had to learn by doing in a tarp enclosure at the back of the garage, with the goal that everything would be solid and okay, not necessarily perfect. Because the plan is to let this slowly fade back to the old patina it once had, knowing that all of the trouble areas is taken care of before they got too bad. And since a large part of the body needed to be resprayed, I wanted to change the color on that to a Land Rover color, better known as Atlantic Green. But the roof and the sides will keep the original limestone white with the patina it has. It is, after all, only a few bolts to take that off if I decide to paint that in the future. However, what I had to do with the roof was to make it waterproof again, or at least as waterproof as a series is supposed to be. So equal to the windows at the front, everything else is also glazed with new runners and seals. And speaking of things which is more likely than not leaking, you have all of the mechanical things on this. And it's grown to be quite a common saying at this point that if your Land Rover ain't leaking, it's probably ran out of oil. And on these old cars that kinda makes sense, but this one was leaking way more than what you'd be sensible to accept. Mostly because it was parked and not driven for a decade with gaskets made out of cork and paper. So on the mechanical side of the build there was a lot of things I had to replace instead of trying to fix, especially since I had to tear everything apart fully to replace every seal and gasket there is. And also because if the car looks old and used, it will do that with pride. But if the internals is equally old and worn, it doesn't really look good on the car. Nor the guy who built it. And being that guy, the one to blame for all of the future breakdowns, it's very nice being fully hands-on during the build. Because as soon as everything is done, the thought of having to fix something on a parking lot or on the side of the road isn't really that terrifying if you know that you fixed it at least once in a controlled environment. The front axle was fully rebuilt apart from the differential, which looks like it's been replaced at some point. But it was obviously put back onto the freshly painted housing with new seals, gaskets and new fasteners all around. And at the ends of the axle you have the swivel hubs, which is basically the only drive and steering connection to the front wheels. And these were assembled with all new parts and bearings apart from the housing itself and the backing plate for the brakes, which I ended up keeping as is with the 10-inch trims at the front and back. However, they are upgraded with a brake kit from LOF, and during the rest of the build absolutely everything that has to do with the brakes needs to be replaced. Basically because it's the only safety feature this car has. Because I can fully handle a Land Rover stopping on the side of the road. It not wanting to stop is the thing that is terrifying. And connecting the axles to the surface of the road is a set of steel rims from a Land Rover Discovery 1, which came with the car but was in desperate need of a restoration themselves. and I decided to keep these because it was much easier to find a fifth one as a spare instead of buying 5 new rims. And later on I was also told that the steel rims from the Discovery is one of the most solid options Land Rover made, so that's another good reason to restore the ones I already had. And similar to the rest of the build, I wanted these to be solid and okay, not necessarily perfect. And after all, they are made out of steel, so the first chip in the paint will start to rust, at least with the amount of salt we have on the roads here. But to give them a fresh start, all 5 are sandblasted, primed with epoxy and finished off with the same white paint as the roof. And that colorway was actually an option at the factory back when this was new, so it will look original with a slightly modern touch. Another good thing with using epoxy for these is that when you eventually get that chip in the paint, it doesn't suck up water like a lot of different primers would do. And marks and scratches in the paint on the car like this is bound to happen, at least if it's used for what it's intended to do. Even though these have a hood mount for the spare, I can guarantee you that Arctic winters with a full-size spare right in front of you is slightly annoying, at least. During the months with snow, it will be harder and harder to get it all off the hood, resulting in quite poor visibility when you're driving, and it's not like the visibility in this is good even during summer. So when I restored all of the doors with new aluminium skins, I also opted for a spare holder at the back door. And this also helps with how the car looks from behind, because it does look kinda naked at the back, especially if you're used to how the Defender looks from behind with a spare at the door. And since I was stripping these fully to replace the skin, I also took the steel frame off the doors and brought that back to life as well. The frames was completely sanded down and all of the awkward angles was sandblasted as well. And before merging the skin and the frame together, both pieces was primed separately. And you have to do that in addition to a sealant in between the aluminium and the steel to avoid a chemical reaction between the different metals, resulting in pretty bad corrosion. And this is what's been happening on most of the alloy parts I had to replace, because the steel has started to corrode the aluminium so bad that it's not even worth trying to fix. And I'm restoring all of these doors instead of just blankly replacing them with new ones, which is easily accessible, because if I wanted to replace absolutely everything, I might as well just build a kit car. Because in some way I'd like to acknowledge that this is a 50-year-old car with 50 years of history, and it would be ruthless to just erase all of that because I want a pretty car. And as a nod to all of that history, I'm leaving marks, imperfections and even stickers at the back windows, placed there by someone at some point somewhere near Cork in Ireland. And a while back I made a short video about keeping that sticker for the very same reason, and interestingly enough I got this comment, which just approved my theory that people appreciate people who appreciate the history behind things, not just the thing itself. And speaking of preserving something in a way that makes sense, I'm definitely not a rivet counter. And by that I mean I'm not unnecessarily picky about small details on the car. But I also don't want to build a car full of parts which is obviously not supposed to be there. So for the bigger items, for example the bulkhead, I'm replacing that with one made specific for my month of production, so that in another 50 years this car will still not be in mint condition, but everything will at least be how it's supposed to be and ready for another restoration in 2074. During the entire build I've made close to 50 episodes with shorter videos showing the progression of the restoration, mostly because that's the videos the most people have interacted with. But if you want more of these long videos or even longer, you have to let me know in the comments. Because in all seriousness, if you subscribe to someone or interact with the videos they make on this platform, it's a lot easier to justify making more of these. So stay put if you want to watch more of the restoration and eventually see this back on the road in everything between Arctic and desert.
I'm buried beneath the sand. There's no way to speak or reach out my hand. Watching the paper slowly unfold, bracing for news that I can't bear to hold. While I'm singing this song to myself, I sing this softly to myself. Tore up my jeans on the fence. This iron road I cannot bend, but my walking is lighter when I walk with a friend. I sing this softly to myself. I sing this softly